All right, so this video is going to pick up right where the last one left off on abolitionism. Now, this one shouldn't take too long. Essentially, abolitionism is the abolishing or getting rid of something. And if you're talking about the abolitionist or abolition movement, you were talking about the people who were trying to get rid of slavery. So this started way back when. Um, some people were always against it. It was just always one of those things, but not until the 1830s did it start to be a real movement. Okay. Um, Abolitionism was closely tied to women's rights. It was also tied to prohibition and the temperance movement. Now, the temperance movement was essentially a movement to limit the use of alcohol, encouraging moderate usage or complete prohibition. Okay, so eventually, this temperance movement and prohibition movement does gain enough force to amend the Constitution for a few years, but that was not um, the best move in US history. It was quite a strange time from what I've read. So, some of the most famous abolitionists are Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was extremely important because before this, most Northerners were able to essentially avoid slavery. They didn't have any concept of what it was. But because she wrote this novel and it showed how terrible slavery was, people started to sit up and notice. As the document mentions, even Queen Victoria over in England noticed it. Um, and I love this quote from Lincoln about her that she was the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. Um, so even Lincoln acknowledged her part in the abolition movement. Another one was William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote his um, Liberator magazine that spread across the North. He would speak at rallies, he would publish various articles, so he was very important in that as well. Probably some of the most important that you know of is Harriet Tubman, who began the Underground Railroad, which, listen to the words coming out of my mouth. The Underground Railroad is not a train. The Underground Railroad is not a real train. The Underground Railroad is a series of quote unquote stops that runaway slaves would go to. It was kind of unofficial routes through places. There would be safe houses, there were certain codes. Um, she escorted over 300 slaves and was, for a while, America's Most Wanted. Um, some others were Frederick Douglass. And one of his big claim to fames, is that um, he was a self-taught slave. And he really himself changed a lot of ways that people felt about slaves because one of the main reasons why people were pro slavery is that they literally thought that people of different skin colors were less than. They did not believe that someone like Frederick Douglass, who was originally a slave, could be so eloquent, could read so well. And one of the biggest things he did was he wrote his own narrative and autobiography, which blew a lot of people out of the water. Um, so not only did he inspire many slaves, as this says, um, but he also changed a lot of white Northerners' perspectives of African Americans. He also mobilized and recruited thousands to enlist in the Union Army, but we'll get to that later. The other one we talked about is John Brown. Okay, and he was mentioned in another reading we did, but essentially he was very divisive. Okay, and he took things a little bit too far at some points. It says that he became militant, which the word basically relates to the military or becoming violent. So, whereas most of these other people were much more pacifist, I guess, or nonviolent at least when it came to abolition, John Brown felt that the only way to end slavery was to get violent. Um, so at one point, he decides to stage a slave revolt at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Okay, and his idea, and he took over the armory. He got a whole bunch of guns and decided to invite all of these slaves to come and join him and take over the armory and essentially fight their way out. Um, no one came. No slaves came. No slaves decided to risk it. Eventually, he was arrested and tried for treason, and this would further divide Americans because people in the North saw him as a quote unquote martyr, someone who died for a good cause, someone they could rally around. But angry Southerners saw him as essentially a murderer because he was planning an armed slave revolt with an aim to kill white slave owners. Um, so not only did this divide the North from the South, but again, some Northerners really didn't agree with him either. They thought that he was going too far. Um, they wanted abolition, they wanted slaves to be free, but they didn't want anyone to die from it. So he was a very controversial figure, and we will talk about him again when we get to Bleeding Kansas. So obviously, this raid at Harper's Ferry, okay, happens after the Bleeding Kansas that we'll get to here in another video. So comprehension questions. According to the reading, what does prohibition and abolitionism probably mean? As long as you were in the ballpark, I marked it correct, and as long as you answered both. Because some people only said that abolition was probably getting rid of slaves, or prohibition was probably stopping something. So as long as you answered both and you were in the ballpark, you're good. For number 2, I was looking for a little bit of specifics. You need to mention somehow that both Garrison and Stowe used their writing talents to promote abolitionism. It made me very happy if you were specific enough and said that he wrote, I just blanked on it. He wrote The Liberator, and she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. So number 3 is one that was frequently missed for not enough or you didn't answer both of these questions. So what is an activist? I was looking for someone essentially that you said an activist is someone who actively does something. They get up and do it. They don't just write about it. They do something about it. I was explaining it to someone in modern day times, a modern activist that most of you have heard of is Greta Thunberg, and all the rallies that she's doing and the meetings that she's doing with the UN and trying to get climate change reversed. Okay, so she's an activist for climate change. But here we are talking about activists for things like abolition. So Tubman, you could say, was an activist because she actually went on the Underground Railroad and helped slaves escape. Douglass, because he, got African Americans to fight for the Union. You could say Brown, because even though it was misguided according to some, he actually got out and did something. He tried to take over and start his own rebellion. Critical thinking questions. Again, most of the reason why you got points taken off is because you just needed more info. It made me happy that a lot of you put that the North saw him as a martyr and the South saw him as a murderer, but you needed to explain why. Okay. So again, think about that. He was a martyr because he was willing to die for the cause that a lot of people were, a lot of Northerners, yeah, they thought that slavery was bad, but a lot of them weren't really willing to raise a finger about it. Where obviously people in the South saw him as a horrible human being that was going to end their world. Okay, so those were the kind of things I was looking for here. And the next video is going to be about the Compromise of 1850, which I'm actually going to spend a decent amount of time on. Okay, and thanks for watching this, guys, and I will be back.